Hey everyone! So I am a language learner currently studying Mandarin Chinese. I'm using what could be known as the Refold method, the AJATT method, MIA. Basically what I'm trying to say is that I am doing primarily input-based learning with a healthy dose of Anki on the side. So recently I crossed the 500 hours of immersion milestone, and I thought I want to talk about it. I have a few things to say, and I think it might be an interesting topic for some people who are just starting out and wanting to know, like, what's it like to have done 500 hours? What do you get from doing 500 hours? And probably most importantly, did it work? I'm not going to tease you. I'll just get right down to brass tacks. The answer is yes. Yes, it worked. But now you're probably wondering, what do I mean by work? What do I mean by it worked? What exactly did I do? Even though I've done it and said it worked, do I consider it a worthwhile endeavor? And, do I have any advice for somebody who's just starting out with immersion? So before getting into all that, I want to mention my background. I think it's important to know what I've done to study before getting to this point. So first off, I've spent maybe like 100 to 200 hours watching Chinese content that's subbed in English. Now, I don't really think this is worth too much because first off, it took place over probably a decade. Secondly, I wasn't trying to learn, so I don't really know how much my brain was processing. And I'm also one of those people where if it's subbed in English, I basically just hear the English in my head instead of really paying attention to what's said. So either way, I don't think it was really worth that much, but for transparency, I wanted to say that. What was worth more though was I did Pimsleur's Mandarin Chinese Unit 1. This taught me some basic vocabulary, but more importantly, it taught me sentence structure, at least basic sentence structure. This is my foothold into grammar before just diving into immersion. Pimsleur's Chinese Unit 1. And I did Pimsleur's probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. You already saw the next point. I've also made about 1,800 audio Anki cards. This was in about 1 year leading up to my 500-hour journey. And yes, audio on the front. That's what I chose to do, and I'll get to why in a minute. But something else I did was I completed Remembering the Kanji Volume 1 a long time ago. And you may be thinking, kanji, that's Japanese, not Chinese. And yes, that's true. In the late 2000s, I decided I want to try to learn Japanese. That's how I actually got familiar with AJATT and immersion learning. So I did RTK1 way back when. I've forgotten most of the kanji now, but it has given me what Refold defines as kanji fluency, or I guess Chinese character fluency, or at least I believe how they define it. Long story short, Chinese characters don't look like chicken scratch to me, and I can memorize them and remember them pretty easily. So I do think that was pretty valuable, even though it was from such a long time ago. And as that alludes to, I have prior experience attempting and ultimately failing, but attempting to learn languages. And I believe this has really helped in my meta skill of language learning. For example, one of the things that I've already mentioned is that I made 1,800 audio Anki cards. Why did I do that? Well, let's just take a pause here for a sec. And I want you to ask yourself, why are you learning your target language? What's the reason for it? For me, it's because there are Chinese people in my life and I want to converse with them. I want to understand what they're talking about. And I want to watch Chinese TV shows with them because that's something you do together as a social thing. All these things are oral based. So my goals are oral based. Now in the past, when I was making cards, I was making like for like Japanese, or I actually experimented on a couple other languages. But when I was making cards in the past, I was just writing the text on the front of the card. And reading is important, don't get me wrong. Reading is a useful skill, but it's not my goal. It's not my dream. So I thought eventually, like, why am I studying something that's not my goal or my dream when I'm trying to accomplish my goal/dream? So from then on, for Chinese, I've only been doing audio only. And so anyway, yeah, that's just the meta skill that I've acquired from other experiences. So the 500 hours, what did that look like? Well, first off, it was entirely active immersion. This is sitting down at my computer, focusing on what I'm watching. That's the mindset. And what am I watching? It's a mixture of things I've seen before, dubbed in Mandarin Chinese, as well as some content that's new to me. Something I've leveraged during this period is like anime dubbed in Chinese. So when I was looking for content, I'd strive to find something that was comprehensible but still interesting. So you may think Peppa Pig is pretty comprehensible, and I think it probably is, but in my opinion, it's pretty boring. So I try to find things that are interesting. On the flip side, historical drama, that's pretty interesting, but also pretty hard to understand. So finding something that's comprehensible yet still interesting, that's usually what I would strive for. And on average, I'd watch about 2 hours a day. On average. So some days I'd watch more, some days I'd watch less. Every day I watched something though. I wanted to keep a streak through this all. And it took me about 8 months to hit this 500 hour milestone. And kind of as I already said, this was all audio plus video. So as in like TV shows. So no podcast and no reading. So what am I doing during the immersion? I'm focusing, I'm paying attention. I did do some dictionary lookups, and I also did for a while something I call transcribing. I don't know if that's the right term, but basically I would try to write out what I was hearing, even if I was getting it wrong. I would just try to do it because it kind of like honed in my listening a little more. But I didn't do either of those tasks too much. The vast majority, I was just listening and trying to pay attention, trying to parse the language, trying to hear words that I know. That's what I was doing. So that's what I was doing for the 500 hours. But what else was I doing? I was making Anki cards. I made 1,300 more cards during that time. And I also did some passive immersion. It was probably less than 100 hours worth. When I decided to do this, I decided to only do it on my free time. This will change in the future, but for this task, I only wanted to do it during my free time. I felt like that was important to make sure I was paying the most attention to what I was doing. And so obviously, when it's my free time, I get to choose what I want to do. So I would always choose active. Well, almost always choose active. So I just feel like near the beginning, active immersion is probably more comprehensible. So I would rather do that than like just more comprehensible by nature. So I'd rather do that than passive, like spend some time drawing and listening to Chinese instead. So how did I improve? This is going to be the meat and potatoes of this video. This is probably going to answer most questions, but it's also the hardest to talk about because I don't want to make it sound like I'm better than I am. I think a lot of people unintentionally do this. We're all familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? I think a lot of people early on will say, oh yeah, I can understand this. I can now read manga and whatever. But they don't realize how much they don't understand. So I kind of want to just kind of focus on the things I felt through several periods and just the general gist of what happened. So the first thing I watched was Inuyasha dubbed into Chinese. And the first few episodes, I could hear nothing, absolutely nothing. It was just whirring by me, just whizzing by, and I could not grasp any common words that I knew from Pimsleur's. Nothing. So it wasn't that long before I made night and day progress with being able to hear and parse the language. I improved dramatically in very short order, and it seemed shocking that I couldn't not understand, but couldn't hear what was being said just in a short time before. So pretty quickly, my parsing ability and hearing ability increased. Also, a little further down the line, slurred speech, which at first was completely unrecognizable, I began to be able to hear it better as well. And an example of this is, I don't practice speaking, so this may sound off or whatever, forgive me. But there's a term, jayang, which I guess it translates to like, I see. If you're studying Japanese, maybe it's kind of the equivalent of soka or aso. Anyway, it's a short phrase, but it usually gets slurred into sounding more like, instead of jayanga, it's janga. I thought they're saying like jang, as in like one word. But as time went on, I'd be able to hear that better and better. And, kind of the process. So at first I could hear nothing, but it wasn't too long until I could hear the words, like the short words that I knew, like how and pronouns and stuff like that, filler words. And then it turned into like short phrases like jianga. And eventually I could understand short interactions, which was pretty miraculous feeling. As a monolingual English speaker, when the two characters would say an entire bit of dialogue and I understood it all, it felt so incredible. It felt like it was just in English, in a different part of English, essentially. So that was really cool. That happened, kind of halfway through, I guess. But nearing the end, you see, when I started, if I didn't know the series very well, or if I hadn't read an in-depth synopsis on the episode, I would have no idea what was going on. But now, I can follow the general plot line of some of the easier things to comprehend, which is a pretty major improvement. I'm not saying I understand everything, I don't, but I at least understand the plot line well enough to be interested and engaged and ready to continue on to the next episode. So, key takeaways. I guess this is kind of relating to, do I think it was a worthwhile time investment doing this? And originally, when I started this 500-hour journey, I was very concerned that I'd feel like it was a waste of time. You got to remember, I did AJATT a long time ago, and I failed, so I was pretty jaded with immersion-based learning. But at this point, I am convinced that spending hundreds of hours on active input in the early stages of language learning is absolutely essential. You have to do it. It's something that has to be done. Now, I wouldn't say you should do it from day one. I know some people say that, and I guess doing it from day one would be good to just, if you want to try to connect to your language for like motivational reasons. But I think you need to have a bit of grammar under your belt. You need to have some basics under your belt. And say if you've completed a language tree in Duolingo, you are ready for immersion. If you've done a unit of Pimsleur's, you're ready for immersion. If you've done several things and you've failed at them all, well, you've accumulated enough. You're ready for immersion too. Do it early. You do it before you think you can, but I guess don't do it on day one. That'd be my key takeaway. Another thing is 500 hours is a lot closer to the starting line than it is to the finish line. This might be pretty obvious, especially if you're familiar with Katsumoto, who said it takes 10,000 hours to learn, say, Japanese. Obviously, 500 is a lot closer to the starting line. But once you spend 500 hours on something, it becomes pretty obvious how big of an undertaking it is and how much further you have to go. So, and it's also a pretty anticlimactic milestone, because although like I've improved massively throughout the process, I'm still at a stage where I don't understand more than I do understand. I have a lot of knowledge. Like I have over 3,000 Anki cards, yet I still have a useless ability. Like I can't converse with people. I can't follow conversations. So yeah, it's a milestone. There's tons of improvement, but it's kind of anticlimactic. So advice. I have a few points of advice, and you're probably going to see a trend here. Track your time. This is absolutely key, I believe. 500 hours is a massive amount of time. In fact, I'll say it's probably an incomprehensible amount of time. And the reason why I say that is before I did this, before I tracked my time, I don't think I understood how much time 500 hours really was. My intuition is most people who don't track their time but give an estimate, if they were to estimate that they've done about 500 hours, they've probably done significantly less. Maybe they've done 150 hours. So I think it's vital to track your time. And if you don't want to track your time, it's probably for one of two reasons. One is it's probably because you think it's too much effort. And if that's what you think, try this. Instead of tracking time, track your episodes that you're watching. So if you're studying Japanese and you're watching anime, well, anime is usually 24-minute runtime. But if we chop off the intro and the outro, that's 20 minutes. So each episode of anime is worth 20 minutes of immersion. So you can just keep track of how many episodes you watch. That should be pretty easy. The other people who may not want to track their time are probably in the camp where they've already started doing immersion and they feel like it's incomplete data, so it's like they didn't start from the beginning, so they don't want to start now. And I get that, but ultimately the amount of time you've spent, unless you've been at this for years, and even if you've been at it for years, the amount of time you've spent is probably not that much in the overall grand scheme of things. So it might be incomplete data, but once you're fluent, it might be the equivalent of like 2% of the time you spent you didn't track. So just start tracking now. It's really important, I think. And on top of tracking, try to make goals. This should help, like mini goals. Try to motivate yourself through stretches. Make mini goals about like just milestones. For example, for me, I made goals for when I got to like 100 hours, 250 hours. I also made what I'll call like gamified goals. So watch an episode of something in Starbucks, or try to get a streak of 5 days where you watch a minimum of 2 hours, or those kind of things. So little fun gamified Duolingo type goals. So make reasonable goals. Also keep a journal. Anytime you have a thought about your language learning process or just about language learning in general, write it down and put a date on it. This will help make it clear to you when you look back where you were at different periods, and it'll really help illustrate your progress. And don't let the language wash over you while you're immersing. So this was one of my problems with AJATT. When I did it, I took Katsumoto's advice of just show up. I took that pretty strongly. I thought if I just turned on the episode, if I just showed up, everything would just click into place. And I showed up, I turned on the episode, but I also tuned out. I spaced out for a lot of the time. I didn't pay attention. Make sure you're paying attention. Don't think about work. Don't think about other things. Think about just what you're watching. Think about what you're hearing. Try to work out the plot line. So don't let it wash over you while you're doing it. Finally, trust the process. 500 hours is a big time investment. Like I said, it took me 8 months to do. You might be able to do it quicker because I did it, like I said, I did it just in my spare time. I also work a full-time job. I have other commitments. I have family commitments and all that. Just trust the process. It won't be long until you see progress, and just know that the progress will add up. You don't need to wait 500 hours to see progress. You only need to wait like maybe a couple dozen. So that's about it, but I do have a pro tip for you. And that is Ranma 1/2 is a great series to watch. So this is a Japanese anime, and it's kind of old, but it's a great series to watch if you're just beginning. It's straightforward, it's entertaining. Like it's set up in a way where there's usually some short arcs, like it lasts an episode or two. Sometimes there's one-off episodes. Sometimes it'll last, I don't know if there's ever a 4-episode arc, but it's like if you don't get what's happening right now, well, in an episode or two, they're going to be on to a different topic, so it's okay. It's really easy to grasp, and the dialogue it's probably the most straightforward dialogue that I've come across. And I believe that's for one reason. And here's something that I didn't really realize until late in this 500-hour journey. I believe comprehension, at least early on, is intrinsically tied to how long each line of dialogue is. The longer a character goes without being interrupted or moving on to something else, the less comprehensible something is. So TV shows where there's long monologues are probably going to be hard to understand. But TV shows where there's quick little dialogue back and forth, that should be more comprehensible. And Ranma is just full of that kind of dialogue. So that's about it. Thank you for watching my video. I hope this has gleaned some light on what the early stages of language learning through input is like. And yeah, I guess I will catch you in the next one.